Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 88, Christmas at War 2022. More great unpublished Christmassy. When we said we would have to be going, they insisted upon shaking hands and almost in unison asked, "Tell you what, laddies, can you nae come to our Hogmanay on New Year's Eve?" The young soldier said to me, "I'm with the British Green Howards and we're trying to get to Dunkirk, but the Germans have us trapped here." Fighting Through listeners have made over 180 contributions directly to the Salvation Army and the Red Cross Ukraine appeals. The Italians had been in running battles with the English, and when they woke up on Christmas Day, they could smell turkey. Hello again, and another World War II Yuletide welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to read family stories, memoirs and interviews with the veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. Today we celebrate another Christmas at war, and indeed Hogmanay, with a stocking absolutely bulging with seasonal tales of guns and goodwill. Bernie Walker has sent in two splendid family stories with an Australian and Italian flavour. And here another spooky or what story from young Captain James Papaglia's Ghostly Adventure series. And learn how some young American soldiers were treated to British hospitality on Christmas and much more. And just to remind you, if you want to fill your December with a catch-up on all the previous Christmas episodes for this podcast, you can access them easily by clicking on the episodes item on the website menu and selecting Christmas. And I, for one, cannot wait. It's what December is for. Here's your starter story. This one's called It'll Be Over by Christmas, and this is based in 1940. I remember when the war started and our next-door neighbour, Minnie Landon, panicking about the blackout. The first time we heard a siren, we all raced into the downstairs passage with our gas masks, where we stood and waited for ages and ages for something to happen. Eventually, we all went back to bed and found out later that what we'd heard had been the all clear. People used to say, "It'll be over by Christmas," and "Don't worry, the Germans have got wooden tanks." Of course, it was all very naive. In the spring of 1940, around May, I remember my dad saying, "We're in trouble now," after the collapse of France just before Dunkirk. That's a story from Ron Jennings of Kidderminster that I found rummaging around on the BBC People at War website. Right now, a bit of listener feedback, so here's just a few snippets. Firstly, from seemingly exotic climes. Sean Paul says, "I work in Tanzania on the Serengeti Plains, and your podcast helps keep me informed and always learning new stories about my favourite history subject. Thanks for all the time you put into your podcast." Alan Morin from America says, "It's good to know that the memories of these fighters are not forgotten. As always, America tips its hat to our cousins, the Brits. Feelings mutual, Alan." And Lee Pearson from America says, "I look forward to getting my headphones on and listening at 7 a.m. every morning." I've got a few BBC People's War stories to share with you throughout this episode, and I think it's timely to share the next one because a lot of reminiscences relate to the period of the Blitz during the Battle of Britain, when London and other cities were being bombed by the Germans. This would have been over the period September 1940 to May 1941, so dampened our Christmas spirit somewhat, though it's clear we had plenty of spirit left over from Dunkirk to see us through. It's interesting that even though London and many other cities such as Coventry and Liverpool took some heavy punishment from the bombing, it came absolutely nowhere near to defeating us. More than 40,000 civilians were killed by Luftwaffe bombing during the war, almost half of them in London, where more than 1 million houses were destroyed or damaged. That's from Wikipedia. Here's just one story. Bombing over Christmas. A story that will live with me for life. I was about 6 years of age, and with my parents, we walked about 2 miles to my grandparents' house in Holloway, Islington in London. It was the usual family gathering over Christmas, and all the members of the family were gathered around the piano, which one of my uncles was playing. No TV in those days. And all of a sudden, there was a tremendous bang. The lights went out, the windows were blown out. The old Victorian house shook. When all the family had recovered, we went outside and found our house was about the only one standing. My parents and I had walked past rows of houses on our way to my grandparents', and now all that was here was dust and bricks. What started out to be a happy Christmas family reunion ended in us all thinking how lucky we were to be alive when most of the neighbours all around us were not. That's Ken Salmon from Islington in London. And hold that thought, there's more to come, but it's not all bad. Amy Whitehead from Huddersfield has been so kind in her comments, and she summed up beautifully by saying, I could, and often do, listen all day. The first episode I listened to was episode 85 about Bill Turner and the Cockleshell Heroes, and from then on I was hooked. Also, by pure chance, I'm originally from Marple in Stockport, so learning about Bill was particularly interesting. Then hearing about Los Moore, a name I know from Marple, was just fantastic. Listener former soldier Los Moore was featured in episode 85 for retracing the steps on the Cockleshell Heroes mission. In fact, nearly 20 Fighting Through listeners clicked on the link in that episode to contribute to his effort to raise money for the British Legion. Amy continued, it's wonderful to have your website to find out more about each episode. I love putting a face to the name or voice on the interview episodes, and the research links are useful and photographs also wonderful. Thank you, Amy. There's more. I've just finished listening to Sergeant Fred Reynard's Gallipoli memoirs. That's episode 16. I can't really put into words the effect it had on me. Never have I listened to such an account, and never have I been so moved. I think the closest I've felt to listening to this was when visiting Normandy with my granddad. What an insight indeed, and how grateful I am that Fred wrote down those words and managed to post them home. Yeah, listener, that's episode 16 about Gallipoli, Sergeant Fred Reynard. Amy has generously sponsored me on Patreon, which monies will go to the Salvation Army. Amy has a family story or two of her own, and she says, my great-grandfather, Cyril Stead, was in the 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, A Squadron, which was the light tank squadron. Although I never met him, I'm the proud custodian of all his World War II paperwork, postcards and photographs, and I spend my spare time researching his war. I visited Normandy with my granddad, his son, and we went on a D-Day landings tour, which was utterly fascinating, if not emotional. I wish I could have met my great-granddad, but listening to your podcast makes me feel a little closer to him in a strange way. I think maybe because I feel as though I can understand his experience a little better through hearing about other people's. I've asked my husband for your dad's book for Christmas. One of my great-granddad's souvenirs is a wonderful postcard written to him from a comrade, Ernie Knowles, who was a POW at Stalag 357 in Germany. I've long been trying to track down Ernie's family, but to no avail. The postcard reads as follows. It starts, Dear Tom, Amy and I grappled over why a letter clearly to Cyril was addressed to Tom, and we concluded that Tom was short for Tommy Gun, a nickname. Sounds to me like Cyril might have been a good scrapper or handy with a Thompson submachine gun. The postcard continues. I'd have written before, but cards are scarce. I'm not doing so badly here, considering where I am. Could do with some discreet news if possible. Have met no one I know so far. Wheatley and Ainsley were wounded, but were okay last time I saw them in June. Hope everyone else got through okay. Regards to Benny and Steve. Had no mail from home yet, but hoping. Getting a game of drafts now and then. Look after yourself. Good luck, Ernie. And that was dated 7th of November 1944 and delivered, dare I say, just in time for Christmas. How good must that have been to hear from a pal who was incarcerated in a POW camp. So if anyone has any information on Ernie Knowles of the 6th Airborne Armed Reconnaissance Regiment, get in touch. Ernie probably made it back home eventually, but I wonder if he knew when he posted that card that 5 months earlier the Allies had been storming up the Normandy beaches on their way to freeing Europe from oppression. I wonder if there was a reply to his postcard which gave him news in the discreet fashion he requested, that the Yanks, Canucks, Brits and other Allies were on their way. Good boys. And Amy, I guess you know that your grandfather's regiment played a significant role on D-Day around the famed Pegasus Bridge region. We'll save that story for another time though, because I know you're still doing your research, but I, for one, cannot wait to learn more. And you've even managed to dig up a brilliant memoir from one of the soldiers that Cyril mentioned in his will, so that's one I'm saving up for another time too. It's funny that Amy emailed me when she did, because right on cue, just before this episode, she came up with a great little wartime anecdote which fits in perfectly with the spirit of some of the stories I'm telling. She says, I used to be an activities organiser in a residential care home, and one of the residents became a dear friend of mine. Her name was Thelma, and she used to tell me tales of when she lived in London during the war. She told me how a house in her street was bombed, and she was evacuated from her house by firefighters. She said she was desperately trying to get back into her house, and the firefighters thought that she must be desperate to get inside to retrieve a child or some other relative, and she told them, "No, I want my tea trolley." I've been saving up my tea and sugar rations for months now, and I'm not letting them go. She'd been saving them for her husband, hoping he would have leave soon, or better still, return for good. Such a lovely and very funny lady. I met quite a few veterans and civilians who lived through the war. It was truly fascinating. Amy, what a truly lovely story, and thanks for sending it in to me. And this would clearly have been in 1940, around the time of the Blitz. And I'll bet it was near Christmas too. As it's Christmas, I'll just share with you a Christmas card that Amy copied me in on. It's a photograph of the regiment of her great-grandfather, Cyril. It's quite fascinating that during the time of war, a regiment would send its soldiers a Christmas card, but maybe it's more common than I think. It's sent from the Airborne Light Tank Squadron, 1st Airborne Division, and it's annotated, later, Recce Regiment, 6th Airborne Division. What a nice souvenir, and there's a copy in the show notes. Coincidentally, Amy's husband Tom had a family story too. And he says, I just got to episode 4 with veteran Wilf Shaw. What a guy he seems. I felt very emotional and almost ashamed when you asked him if it was all worth it. It threw a massive dose of perspective on the world we live in today. It also struck a chord with me that when you were talking about having battle scars, it made me think of my own granddad. Listener, before I carry on with Tom's story, I just want to outline briefly something called the Aden conflict. This took place 1963 to 67, and it was an insurgency against British rule in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. The unrest hastened British plans for withdrawal and marked the end of 20 years of decolonisation. Thank you to Wikipedia for that. Tom continues, I actually lost my granddad a couple of years ago, and he served in the conflict in Aden when he was 18. He actually lost his arm when he was 19, when an enemy vehicle ran the canvas-back truck he was riding in off the road, rolling it and crushing his arm in the process. So they amputated it just below the shoulder. I was told as a kid he lost it wrestling a crocodile, but I think the actual story was far more interesting. He was known as Happy Whitehead because of his jolly nature and went by the name Happy his whole life. Tom and Amy Whitehead from Huddersfield, thank you both so much for taking the trouble to send those letters in. Really appreciate it. Now, talking about Christmas, just for a moment, I'd like to give a quick plug for Dad's book. I only have 3 first edition hard copies left. Forget £45 on Amazon. Yes, really. £25, including UK postage, gets you a signed edition with a selection of souvenir photos and a fighting through bookmark. Outside of the UK, I'm afraid postage has almost become more than the cost of the book itself, so you might be better trying other sources, but I'll be happy to quote. £5 from the sale will go to the Salvation Army, and there are plenty of paperbacks available, though not through me. The links for these books are on the book page on the menu at the Fighting Through World War II website, or just check out Amazon and eBay. But for those 3 first edition hard copies I mentioned, just contact me direct through the website, fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk. I am still receiving surveys via the link on the home page. This one's from Dave Edgerton in the UK, who comments, you have a 58-year-old crying at times, laughing at others. I'm on episode 26. Way to go, Dave. And Andrew Foster from New Zealand says, you've brought your father's fantastic story to life. It would make a great mini-series, particularly as you've researched the early days in France with Major Petch, as well as North Africa and the campaigns in northwestern Europe later on. I feel someone prominent could portray his experiences sensitively and accurately. Sam Mendes comes to mind. Andrew, you mean Sir Samuel Mendes, who includes Jarhead, Skyfall and 1917 in his repertoire, amongst many others. Wow. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that praise indeed for Dad's story. It does seem to be evolving into an epic that just keeps getting better and better, and I wonder if Sir Samuel is listening. A bit of war stuff now, and this is a post-combat report by Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader over Dunkirk. Oh my word. And this was posted up on the France and Flanders campaign 1940 Facebook page. So it's well worth joining that Facebook page if you're interested in Dunkirk, etc. Of course, Douglas Bader was probably the most famous fighter ace in Britain during the war. His name is legend, and the movie is a classic must-see. So to be able to read a flight report written by him is just amazing. Here goes. So this is a typewritten report on paper. It's headed up Flight Lieutenant Barder, Combat Report 2. And the main headings as a summary here, there's fire from fighters. Range opened, 200 yards deflection, I think that is. And length of burst, 2 of 3 seconds and 1 of 7 seconds. Range closed, 50 yards on the second. Rounds fired per gun, 297. General report. As 222 and 41 squadrons were patrolling Dunkirk from east to west, below 10/10ths of cloud at 3,000 feet, I saw 3 Heinkel 111s flying inland from out to sea. Yellow 2 and 3 had both gone home for various reasons, and I turned out from behind red section to attack the nearest 111, which was not near the other 2 Heinkels I saw. I found Blue Leader, Flight Lieutenant Robinson, and another Spitfire, Sergeant Johnson, also attacking this aeroplane, which began by firing cannon from the rear top turret at a Spitfire on its tail, Blue 1. As Blue 1 closed, the rear gunner ceased fire. I gave the Heinkel 1 3-second burst from beam, passed over it, and turned on to another 3-second beam attack without apparent result. I carried straight on to an astern attack on a second unattended Heinkel 111 about a quarter of a mile from the first, and gave it a long burst, 6 seconds, from astern. The rear gunner began by firing at me with cannon, and stopped when I'd closed to about 100 yards. The Heinkel was very near the water, with starboard engine apparently idling, but I saw no other apparent result of my attack. This Heinkel took avoiding action by banking each way. I then turned for home with 15 to 20 gallons of petrol and some ammunition left. Signed, D.R.S. Barder, Flight Lieutenant, 222 Squadron. There you go. I thought that was nice to share. I've put a link to the actual posting and the comments in the show notes if anybody wants to view them. A bit more war stuff. For anyone who enjoyed my German Eyes episode a while back featuring Jonathan Trigg's book D-Day Through German Eyes, you might be interested to know that Angus Wallace of the World War II podcast recently interviewed Jonathan. So there's a good opportunity there to link some great published history with the man who wrote it. There's a link in the show notes. Even more war stuff. German music now. For anybody who enjoys that rousing, thumping, pieing of German marching songs, I stumbled across a Spotify playlist the other day, which you might be interested in. I can't play any now for copyright reasons, but there is another link in the show notes. Even more war stuff. SAS Rogue Heroes is a new series on BBC One tracking the conception of the famous British Special Air Services as it wreaks havoc behind enemy lines in the North African desert. They start off a bit slow with a couple of water pistols and half a dozen spark plugs, but they finish up with a fleet of jeeps with bulletproof windscreens nicked from aeroplanes and with Vickers machine guns mounted on them. It just gets better and better, and the finale is just great, with leader Paddy Mayne walking into the sunset, promising even more madness and mayhem in the next series. So that's SAS Rogue Heroes. If you have to, take out a year's subscription to BBC iPlayer just to get this one series. Talking about Christmas again, here's a passage about Hogmanay, New Year's Eve, from Dad's book. You've not heard this before. Dad was wounded in Normandy in June 1944, having landed on Gold Beach with the first wave on D-Day. During his World War II recovery, he was stationed at Glencorse Camp just outside Edinburgh in Scotland for a period. and met some Scotsmen in a pub leading to a hospitable Hogmanay with their families. This is Dad's story. Several of the lads had suffered leg wounds of different kinds and severity, and we had to go for short, steady walks, which gradually increased in length and pace, but 15 miles was the limit until our legs became stronger. The nearest small town to Glencorse camp was Pennycook, which was 2 miles away, and since I'd palled up with a Geordie, we made several excursions into the town. But back then, in 1944, it was rather a quiet place, and since it entailed a 4-mile walk, we soon stopped that lark. Our next off-duty trip was to Edinburgh, which was 10 or 12 miles away. Neither of us had been there before, so we thought it might be interesting. It was a bitterly cold second week in December, and we decided to go into a little pub in Princes Street for a shandy. It was cheaper than beer, and the old problem of financial embarrassment still plagued us. 2 men in their early 40s came and sat next to us, and upon hearing our accent started to chat. As they were Scots, I brought up the fact that I was in the 50th Division and that we always fought alongside 51st Highland Division. That really set their tongues wagging, and they wanted to know all about the 51st, during which time they bought us a whisky, which almost burnt my throat since I was not a drinker of spirits anyway. When we said we'd have to be going, they insisted upon shaking hands, and almost in unison asked, "Tell ye what, laddies, can ye nae come to our Hogmanay on New Year's Eve?" Well, at that time, I don't think I knew what a Hogmanay was, and they laughed and gave us a detailed explanation of what it was all about. It sounded okay to us, but we'd need a little time off from camp, which was most likely impossible. We said we'd meet the Scots in a couple of days, same pub, same time. Next day, I spoke to our NCO, who seemed to have softened a little towards us. I'd discovered that he was not a bad sort at heart, and he said he'd speak to the captain to try and fix an interview for my mate and me. I was sent for the next morning, and I told no fibs, just the facts, telling him about the Scots in the pub, and I asked if we could be allowed to stay out overnight. He was silent for a while, then suggested that since we were due for a 3-day pass anyway, he would grant permission, simply on the grounds that 1 night off camp would not be enough to recover from a Hogmanay, and were we sure we knew what we were doing. We'd found a chink in the rigid routine at Glencorse. It was not so bad after all. On New Year's Eve, we made the trip into Edinburgh to meet our 2 friends. We first went to the same little pub for a drink, where the atmosphere was warming up, ready for the festivities. The drink over, our host took us to one of their houses, where we were introduced to his wife. As the evening wore on, more folk turned up, just enough to make a sociable gathering. We were the only foreigners present, and some wanted to know more about us. Just to hear mention of the 51st and 50th Divisions pleased them enormously. To cut a long story short, by the time it was midnight, we were just a teeny-weeny bit drunk, but not too far gone to hold hands and sing Auld Lang Syne. What happened after that? I hadn't a clue. The mood of everybody was marvellous. All those Scots taking us 2 English lads to their hearts, and they looked after us for 3 days, then took us back to camp. I had a very strong feeling that our captain knew all about Hogmanay. It was now 1945. Back to present day. A few weeks ago, I was planning a family trip to Edinburgh and wondered what the chances were of tracking down the pub that Dad and his pal went to when they met the Scots lads. I was short on detail, but I put together what information I had and posted it on the Edinburgh Past and Present Facebook page, along with Dad's story, hoping I'd get one or two suggestions. And I posted, I'm wondering if anyone can suggest which pub my dad went into on Princess Street during the war. I'm coming to Edinburgh next week and would like to toast his memory with a wee dram of the good stuff at a pub that he might just have gone in. I guess there are lots of pubs on Princess Street, but I'm looking for one that might typically have been frequented by servicemen and or maybe at one end more likely than in the middle. Dad wouldn't have had the money to spend on an extensive pub crawl, and I reckon the pub would have been close to one end of the street, maybe the end nearest to where public transport would have brought them from Glencorse camp. Of course, thinking about it, Dad and his pal probably walked because it was 12 miles, so that was within the limits they were allowed. I bet they walked back. Anyway, how could I have known what a deluge of suggestions, support, memories and anecdotes would flow from this enquiry? So keep your sporran tightly fastened while I rattle off this little lot. The first thing I was put right on more than once is that it's not Princess Street, but Prince's Street. And in fact, Prince's Street is one of the main thoroughfares in Edinburgh. So duly noted for the third edition of Dad's book when we get there. Here goes with the Traveller's Guide to Ye Wee Oldie Edinburgh Pubs. Alan Bailey kicked the ball rolling, saying, I've no knowledge of there ever having been cosy wee pubs on Prince's Street. David Law said, at the very east end of Princess Street, there are two old pubs that are just a very short spit away, the Café Royal and the Guildford. Andrew Cross had an anecdote to share, and he says, there was one story I heard about how there were so many different uniforms worn by visiting military that 3 jokers got hold of Waffen-SS uniforms and walked along Princess Street without being stopped. Oh, God, very good, Andrew. Neil Lawrence said there was a big wooden hut at the side of the art galleries at the bottom of the mound during the war. It was a respite centre for the forces and had a canteen, pub, sleeping and washing facilities. Might have been there. Morag MacDonald Worsley says Scott's Bar in Rose Street is one of the oldest pubs. It would definitely have been in existence. Quite an institution and a typical old spit and sawdust pub back in the day. Irene Day recommended the Guildford. Been there for years. My granny was a cleaner there in the 30s. Shirley Russell said, a lovely reminiscence. I can't enlighten you on the pub, but I'm from Pennycook, and my dad, who was from Leeds, met my mum while stationed at Glencorse Barracks around 1955. But his dad had died on Normandy Beach. Hope you find the pub you're looking for. Carol Sutherland said, what a lovely story. I hope you find it, but if not, any pub in Edinburgh will do. My brother-in-law was in the Navy and he used to look up any Sutherlands abroad and tell them he was a relative and almost always got taken out for a meal. Suggestions turned to Rose Street. Bob Cairn said, fascinating story, but I don't think there were ever any pubs on Princess Street. The main street for pubs was Rose Street. Take note, any future travellers. Gary MacDonald said, my wife's father talked of the pubs on Rose Street. He was with the King's Own Scottish borderers who landed on Sword Beach, and he was wounded at Cairn. He also did time at Glencorse, as did I, so there's a bit of a tentative link. I'd suggest you go to any pub on Rose Street and raise a glass, as many old soldiers would have done anywhere along that street. Better still, just to be sure, raise a glass in every pub in Rose Street. Oh dear, chances are you will get the same experience and not have a clue how it all ended up. Slanty. At least I thought it was slanty. An obvious word for cheers, until I dutifully Googled it to find it was Slanjavar. Oh, we've got another bit of fighting through slang there. That's a great word. Slanjavar. Cheers. Leslie Gill asked her dad, soon to be 96, about all this. And he said there wasn't a pub in Princes Street, but he does remember a hotel between the Mound and Jenner's that was taken over by American servicemen, and that's where they seemed to congregate. He thought the pub you're talking about was maybe the Guildford Arms, which is just off Princes Street. Shauna Todd suggested, what about climbing Arthur's Seat and having a wee dram up there too? Wrap up warm and enjoy the view of Edinburgh. Enjoy, but just make sure you're nearly at the bottom before sunset, or take big torches. Louise Parker said, love the story. Smiley face with hearts. Thanks for sharing. Enjoy your dram in Edinburgh. Stuart Ogston nearly put his finger on it, I think. Visit both the Guildford and the Café Royal. They're both lovely in their own way. The tiles in the Café Royal are stunning. Ian White said 50th Division was based at Newcastle and contained many Scots from the Scottish borders, including one John White, my uncle from Castle Douglas. He was also in the first wave of landings on Gold Beach. He had an interesting army service, including getting left behind at Dunkirk alongside the 51st Division. He and some pals made their own arrangements to return to Blighty, which pleased my gran and grandad no end, as he'd been officially posted missing. Then he had some adventures in Tobruk, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium and Holland, Operation Market Garden, before D-Mob. I wonder if they knew your dad. Jackie Potter. Can't help with a pub, but our Hogmanay partying and the hospitality shown to everybody has not changed if you want to share your dad's experience. Lovely memory. And then I've got a handful of people who are all recommending the Guildford, including Alexander Harvey, who said, how about the Guildford Arms? That was always, back in the day, a gentleman's bar. Margaret Mackenzie pretty much tied things up. A delightful story. Hope you find the right place. My dad was returning from a POW camp in 1945 and landed in Edinburgh. He was trying to visit his pen friend, soon to be his wife, on the Isle of Bute. He had to get to Glasgow, then to Wemyss Bay to catch a ferry. Allegedly, it took a few pubs before they could find anyone who could help. The Guildford was the last pub he remembered being in. Has no recollection of the journey, but on leaving the ferry, found himself in Guildford Square once again, seeking directions. Of all the pubs in Edinburgh, this one would be my recommendation. Enjoy. Thank you, Margaret. That's a nice story too, and probably pushes the Guildford past the finishing post. And your dad's name, shout out for him, was Robert James Thorne, born in 1920 in Wellington Barracks, an army brat. There were others too many to mention, but there's a link in the episode notes if anyone wants to see the full discussion. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to that. My conclusion is that Dad went to the Guildford. Anyway, it looked nice enough from the outside, so I settled on that. But what a shame Dad didn't take a photograph. But they could barely afford a shandy, let alone a camera. So to confirm, we did go to the Guildford. Upstairs bar with a view of downstairs over the balcony. And I took some pics for my dad. You can see them in the show notes. The Guildford is a lovely old pub with the most amazing decor and really pretty close to Princes Street, which is no doubt what Dad remembered. And needless to say, I had several drams in honour of Dad, his unknown Geordie mate, and all you lovely people who've contributed to this pub hunt with such great suggestions and stories to go with them. Who'd have thunk it? Slante, or should I say Slanjavar. And thank you to Holly Wilson, who was such a great waitress in the pub and recommending which drams to partake in. Trouble is, I had so many I can't remember. Oh, yes I can. It was in the memory of the late tank Captain Stan Perry, who regaled us so well with his tales of daring do in his interview. I had more than one, and it was a Lafrogue single malt, which is one that he was keen on. Slanjavar Stan. Slanjavar Dad and his mate. So, thanks again to all you lovely people who contributed to that Facebook page, and also to the people of Edinburgh for being such brilliant hosts to their tourists. I can thoroughly recommend historic Edinburgh as a lovely place to visit. Everything's within reasonable walking distance, no train journeys to get, no tubes or buses. And my personal highlights were the castle with its military museums and much more, and Mary King's Close, which is an ancient underground street unchanged from medieval times. And I'll never forget the Guildford Arms pub and the wee drams I had, which for a fleeting moment put me in my dad's shoes and whisked me back to 1944 Hogmanay and being looked after by those fantastic folk of Scotland. On to another story now, and here's a nice childhood memory from Mary Jackson of Birmingham. This is from the BBC site. Everything had been prepared for Christmas Day, and this Christmas Eve we'd had a party tea early. Got ourselves washed and into socks, pyjamas, shoes and jumpers, and our hats, coats, gloves and pillows were to hand as usual, whilst we waited for the air raid sirens to start wailing. By 7 o'clock nothing had happened, so we continued to play about in the unaccustomed space of the living room. Mother, consulting father, tentatively put hot water bottles into beds, and at 7:30 made up the fire. The two little ones were put to bed, and we were allowed to stay up late and listen to the wireless. The city had done its best to show a festive spirit, but of course there were no lights after dark. Everyone was asked to conserve water and fuel, so the commercial side of Christmas was very poor compared with 2 years previously. All was still peaceful at 8:30 p.m, so we were packed off to bed. It was strange going upstairs and climbing into a proper bed without your jumper, your coat and your pixie hood, and maybe even your gloves, which is what we'd normally have to do in the Anderson shelter, which was extremely cold and ran with condensation. But the bedroom was freezing cold too, and you could feel the lino through your socks. It seemed very bright outdoors, and having put out the light, we lifted the blackout curtains and looked out. The moonlight was absolutely beautiful. The stars were brilliant, and already the frost sparkled on the lawn, the hedges and the roofs. It was a true bomber's moon. Mother came up to tuck us in and found us kneeling at the window. It may have been the heart of industrial England, but the tranquility of the scene was incredible. Everyone knows that windows can produce bars of light through condensation and faults in the glass, and our windows were no exception. But no matter how I moved my head and squinted, the vision remained the same. I rubbed the window with my pyjama sleeve, and it was still there. I said, "Mum, there's a cross on the moon." She said, "No, darling, it's just the faults in the glass." Joan could see it too, so even though the temperature was below zero, we pushed up the sash. There was this brilliant moon, and over it an even more brilliant cross. We sat and looked at it, savouring the peace of it all, until Mother told us to get into bed before we caught cold. But she said it very quietly, kissed us goodnight, and went downstairs. Shortly afterward, I heard the front door open, and I think my parents must have gone outside together. I cannot remember Christmas Day, but I do know we had no air raids anywhere in the country that night. But it was back to normal on Boxing Night, when we heard the Junkers engines almost before the sirens. There was never anything in the papers, either local or national, about this event. But I cannot imagine that such a vision of hope, in the midst of all the hardship and misery, was granted only to two little girls and their parents. Well, from one spooky story to another, after great feedback on last episode's Spooky or What story, written by 7-year-old James Papaglia, James's dad Frank has followed up with chapter 2 of his son's book of short stories, and this one even has a surprise Christmas theme to it. Last time, you might recall James was playing with his sisters in modern times and mysteriously found himself on Omaha Beach, witnessing the American forces struggling to overcome the German defences. Just as they succeeded, he tripped and ended up somewhere new. But where was I? He asked. So this is chapter 2, The Secret Getaway, by James V. Papaglia, and this is set in May 1940. I woke up in a foxhole, but I was not in Stone Harbour. I looked for my family, but they were not there. Instead, I saw something different. I saw people speaking French. I heard British accents and saw a lot of scared soldiers. But where was I? I tried to talk to the soldiers, but they were either too scared or did not speak English. As I walked around to figure out what was going on, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, shot at us. I was running with the soldiers away from the danger when a German Stuka came right for me. A soldier ran up to me and tackled me into the water. "Man, you saved my life," I said. "Son, what are you doing here? You're going to get killed," said the soldier. We ran from the Stukas and hid in a bomb crater. The British soldier asked me, "Son, how did you get here?" I looked at him and I said, "Long story, how about you?" The young soldier said to me, "I'm with the British Green Howards, and we're trying to get to Dunkirk, but the Germans have us trapped here." I asked him, "How did you get trapped?" He said, "We came here and got pushed back, and now there is nowhere left to run." He and I talked about the escape plan. He told me that Churchill was going to send lots of ships to get us out. As we spoke, the ships began to arrive. Major Petch looked at the soldier and said, "Our boat, the Lady of Man, is here. Get going." The soldier said to me, "Well, I'd better get moving. Are you going to be okay, son?" I said to him, "I will be just fine. By the way, what's your name?" The soldier looked at me and said, "Bill Cheel. Do you think I'll be home for Christmas?" I told him, "Not this Christmas, but another one, and you will have a great life. Good luck, Bill." As I got on board, the Stukas returned and began to fire. I jumped in the water. When I came to the surface, I was somewhere new. But where? James, thank you once again for that spooky history lesson. I must admit I was really surprised when my dad's name came up, and I thought it was so clever the way you did it. I'm copying in Sarah Parry, the granddaughter of Captain Tom Woods of the Lady of Man ship, because I just know she'll be interested in what was going on the beaches whilst her grandfather was sitting in Dunkirk harbour waiting for the soldiers to arrive. And I know the Lady of Man herself didn't escape from the Stukas either. When she finally got back to England, there was plenty of damage to repair, so I think Dad and his pals were very lucky to get home safely. And of course, one of the Lady of Man lifeboats has been found and restored in recent times by Matt Kane, so he'll be pleased to hear your story too. James, I was fascinated by your prediction that Dad wouldn't get home for Christmas, and it puzzled me, because he's just about to get back to England on the Lady of Man, so surely he'll be home for Christmas. This made me check Dad's whereabouts upon his return, and indeed, James, you were right. He might have been in England for Christmas, but he didn't get home, because most of 1940 he was down in the south of England guarding the coastline against an expected German invasion. In 1941, he was posted to the north of England, to Richmond, where his regiment, the Green Howards, headquarters were. And right through 1942, Dad does not mention Christmas in his book until he's posted to the Middle East and finds himself on that magnificent ship, the Queen Mary. And here's just a short passage from Dad's book about how his Christmas 1942 went. One day, Dad and his pals embarked on a long journey through England and ended up in Scotland. We arrived at Glasgow early morning on 20th of December. I'd never been this far north before, or even to Scotland, so it was all new to me. People in those days just did not travel as they do today. From Glasgow, we travelled to Greenock on the Firth of Clyde, and the docks were crowded with ships of all sizes. It was a bitter cold morning, and there was a slight mist. We were no sooner off the train than small boats were ferrying us towards the centre of the harbour to a very large ship which dwarfed everything around it. To see the words Queen Mary on the bows of that ship was almost beyond my comprehension. It seemed almost impossible that we were to go overseas on such a majestic ship. I had never imagined that I would ever see the Queen Mary, let alone travel on it, and I felt very proud to be British. We boarded the ship through wide doors at the side of this cavern of a ship, and the size of the interior fascinated me. There were 11 decks, and 15,000 personnel were packed into it. Each party had its own quarters, and notices had been posted on the passageways giving directions to those areas. On those long corridors and staircases, one could easily get lost on the ship. The decks had been covered with special flooring to give protection against our army boots, although when we'd settled in, we changed to denims and sand shoes. We each had a hammock and were rather crowded, but there was plenty of room on other parts of the ship. My two pals and I managed to get places near each other. Looking back to those days, we still did not know for where we were bound. This was the one time we could have been told, because there was no danger of us telling anybody ashore. We just lived each day as it came. We sailed on 23rd of December 1942, and without an escort, which surprised us, but we were told that the ship's speed made it unnecessary. All I could feel and hear was the steady, powerful throb of the engines and the rise and fall of the ship as we headed out into the Atlantic. It was not very long before we were feeling most miserable. Anybody who's never been seasick cannot have a clue how rotten it makes one feel. Despite the size of the ship, the speed of it was causing it to toss about quite a bit. Consequently, we were all very seasick, and it was awful. For 3 days I didn't care whether I lived or died. That's how bad it was. Christmas had been and gone before I recovered. I will never forget Christmas 1942. My best pal, John Bousfield, and another pal, Norman Young, had it really bad. I looked after them both, feeding them and putting them to bed, as the sickness can play havoc with your strength. We gradually became used to the roll of the ship as it cut through the water, and began to explore the ship, and only then realised how large it was. There we leave Dad and his pals. If you want to learn more about his memorable voyage, check out episode 30, Queen Mary. Or better still, snap up a copy of Dad's memoirs, Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. Thanks to Lisa Loftis from Springfield, Missouri, for linking me to some letters sent home from a soldier in a POW camp. This is a selection of Christmas letters sent by John Crook to his parents in 1943 and 44 during his time as a POW at Stalag Luft 8B camp. 12th of December 1943 to begin with. My dears, a very happy Christmas is in store for me after all, for I've received your first letter. So glad and relieved to learn that you're well and have survived the suspense of waiting for news from me. What with Red Cross Christmas parcels and plenty of fuel, we shall do all right over the festive season. Very Christmassy weather, snow and ice. Love from John. More Christmas news, carols, Messiah Band concert, cabaret, pantomime, everything in style. As you didn't get my first card, I'd better repeat. Captured Salerno, 10th of September, with all the boys. Busy decorating our barrack with paper chains, etc. Best love, John. 20th December 1943. Amidst the Christmas decorations, I've at last found time to write you a line. So intensely busy about rehearsals and writing parts, teaching Greek, cooking gelatine and chips, planning a chamber music concert and acting as usual as a general confidant and receiver of everyone's troubles, that only just before bed can I fit a letter into my dearest ones. Anyway, there's no time to pine away. You need not bother much about sending clothes. We're pretty well set up. But cigarettes, if possible, because they are currency here, and one can obtain for them anything from a banjo to a tin of porridge. Last night, conducted a string octet in Eine kleine Nachtmusik, very successfully. Give my love to all the kind friends who are so concerned for my safety, and tell Sister Geron I lost the medal with my identity discs from off my neck. Thereby hangs a tale to tell when I come home. 26th of December 1943. Boxing Day. Had a good Christmas. Pudding, steak and kidney, jelly, cake, beer, and your second letter. What a lovely programme it seems you had at Maidstone. The Brahms is one of my favourites. Also the Bach. The boys are all very grieved about Dalton passing. He was with the Colonel and they were wounded together. Best New Year wishes in hope of a speedy reunion. Captain Williams was adjutant of the 8th Battalion, so we know nothing of him. Don't be surprised if you hear from Mrs. Morgan or Mrs. Phillips, the mother of our fairy godfather here. Don't put my army number on my address. God be with you always, your loving John. Christmas Day 1944. My dear mother and father, in the midst of decorations, cakes, stalag maid, greetings and whatever good cheer we can put into a prison camp at Christmas, and on a perfect day, dry, cold, sunny, and with all the trees and wires covered in frost, I must just tell you how much I wish I were home, and how much I long to see your dear faces again. This is a brave effort. Dances, concerts, parties, shows, band programmes, and everyone in their best khaki slacks and with her boots and buttons polished. But everybody's heart really is at home, and especially mine, because I love you both so much. I am still thinking and hoping how best to repay you for all your love and your confidence in me, and I trust to be home soon to start. I've had a very pleasant Christmas present, for my recognition papers here at last came through, and Dick Morgan's as well. The Christmas show is the Yeoman of the Guard, with the RAF Choir and the Cambridge Orchestra, and some positively sumptuous costumes. A great deal of work has been put into it, and it has turned out a fine show, and could give points to most amateur dramatic societies. Once more, all my love. Remember the hope of Christmas. John. And that's the end. Lisa, thank you so very much for sending those in. What a lovely bunch of thoughts and good wishes for Christmas. Christmas 1943. Emergency cream, Sawyer marzipan and Christmas cakes. Dad kept a grocery shop in Aldershot. During wartime, he dreaded Christmas. Customers clamoured for extra items, especially dried fruit for cakes and puddings. Mum, Dad and I stayed up late to weigh up portions of mixed unwashed sultanas and currants, knowing well that everyone would grumble and groan at the mere handful, nowhere near enough to make a cake or a pudding. In 1943, Dad unwisely took orders for Christmas cakes. These were promised by his bread suppliers, a large national bakery firm. They delivered 1 iced, fruity Christmas cake, 1 uniced fruit cake, and 6 plain cakes. Dad had orders for 20 cakes, so his first task was to decide which 12 people would be told just 2 days before Christmas that there was no cake for them. The next problem was to turn the remaining 7 cakes into something looking vaguely like Christmas cakes. Mum and I got the job of icing and decorating. I was 11 years old. To do 7 cakes in 1 day would be hard with all the resources available now. To do it in 1943 was nigh on impossible. Our first thought was to make the plain cakes tastier by putting a layer of cream in the middle. Real cream wasn't available in wartime, so we used a recipe for emergency cream, which went like this. Heat half a pint of water, melt a tablespoon of unsalted margarine in it, sprinkle 3 heaped tablespoons of national dried milk into this, and beat, then whisk. Add 1 teaspoon sugar, 1/4 teaspoonful of vanilla essence. Leave to get very cold. Well, you can imagine how ghastly that tasted. It was also very lumpy. But the far more difficult problem was to devise some substitute for marzipan. There were no ground almonds, nor fresh eggs. We used water, dried egg, soya flour, and almond essence. The resulting paste was a brilliant yellow. The combination of soya and almond essence gave off a strong bitter aroma, which might pass for the smell of marzipan, provided it was breathed through a gas mask. The paste was suspiciously sticky. Mum and I took a cake each and literally stuck to our task. We scraped the paste off our fingers and pressed it on the cakes. As fast as we put it on, it rolled off, falling around each cake like the flabby folds of a fat stomach. Every time we pushed the paste back, we rubbed off some of the cake. Although the cakes got smaller, there was the advantage that the paste got thicker with the rubbed off crumbs and eventually stayed in place. At last, we had a row of cakes, admittedly grubby looking and strangely dome-shaped. All they needed was a final glossy coating to give them a professional finish, boards to rest upon, and a bit of ribbon. Looking at them, Mum and I were seized by nervous giggles. Miraculously, we had some icing sugar, and by mixing it with water to a concrete-like consistency, we were able to put a passable rough coating over the domes. They looked like storm-tossed beehives. We hadn't the nerve to put Happy Christmas on top. When Dad came to admire our handiwork, we knew it was time to quit. We beat a hasty retreat to the pictures, the movies. After Christmas, every customer who had one of our unique cakes complained about the unconventional shape, lack of fruit, messy cream centre, the repellent marzipan, and above all, about the tiny nugget of cake so difficult to find under its monstrous dome. Dad, stung by their ingratitude, had only one reply. "Don't you know there's a war on?" That was by Hogmanay in Aldershot, England. Bernie Walker from Australia has sent in 2 splendid family stories with an Australian and Italian flavour. These were sent in months ago and I've been saving them for the Christmas episode. Bernie says, "Good morning, Paul. I was re-listening to one of your father's stories in North Africa that reminded me of an old Italian neighbour I had when I was living west of Sydney. We'll call him Tony. We were clearing a hillside of thistles together, and when we were having a break, Tony started to tell stories from World War II. He was in an Italian unit that had been fighting for a long time in the desert without a rest, was worn out, and by this time they were running very short of supplies and were very poorly fed. His unit had been in running battles with the British, and when they awoke on Christmas Day, 1942, they could smell turkey. He went with a few of his unit, following the delicious smell of the turkey, and crawled to the top of a sand dune to look down and see the British camp, complete with tables set up with white tablecloths and proper cutlery, ready for Christmas lunch. They went back to their camp and told the rest of the Italian soldiers what the British were going to be eating for lunch. There was some arguing, but it didn't last long, as they felt so let down by Mussolini and Hitler. Tony asked, "How do we best tell Mussolini to go and get stuffed?" All 200 of them marched over the sand dune with their hands up. They were fed well for the first time in months and really enjoyed it. They enjoyed Christmas 1942 with the British. The story didn't stop there, as Tony was sent to Ceylon and spent the rest of the war in a British POW camp. There were a lot of POWs and guards suffering from malaria, and there was a doctor doing research and was wondering why some of the POWs never suffered from malaria. The doctor had a glass box full of mosquitoes. When Tony stuck his arm in the rubber opening, the mosquitoes parted like the Red Sea. The other POWs that had the same diet as Tony from childhood had the same reaction with the mosquitoes. The claim was that having chili and onions kept the mosquitoes away. Sicilian diet, Tony claimed, was the best. He went back to Italy then, and due to how bad things were after the war in 1948, he had a chance to come to Australia, where, along with many other Italians, went to work on the Snowy Mountain Hydro scheme. And a parting comment from Bernie: "My heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. Keep up the hard fight. Keep up the good work on the podcast. Thanks again, Paul." Bernie, thank you very much for that. And your comment about the Ukraine prompts me to give everybody an update on how the Fighting Through Ukraine campaign is going. Can you believe Fighting Through listeners have made over 180 contributions directly to the Salvation Army and Red Cross via the links in the show notes are at the top of my website page. I'm blown over by that generosity, so thank you very much. If you value what I do and have never donated to the show, please consider following the links in the show notes and popping just a £5 in the pot. The feedback we get in the UK is that there's still a lot of hardship in Ukraine, so they still need our support. Bit of feedback now from Martin Matthewson, who is a self-avowed binge listener. He says, my grandmother was strafed by the Luftwaffe in Croydon. We didn't think to ask for the detailed account before this generation left us. P.S. I have set a regular payment to the Salvation Army, as I see it's the charity of your choice, and I can apply the gift aid. Great work, many thanks. Thank you, Martin, good man. And your story reminds me of one of mine. I've got a dear departed friend, Rodney, who used to tell us all that when he was a baby in a pram, he was strafed by the Germans during the war. He wasn't. He said that as the German planes came over, his mother threw herself headlong under his pram to take cover. She didn't, but it was a funny story. Time for another Christmas story. This is Christmas 1944, and it's called Potato Peelings, another BBC People's War website story. Talking about whiskey, which we were earlier, or in the case of this next story, grappa, this one is about a childhood in Nazi-occupied Italy, and it's from Peter Giringelli. Christmas 1944 was a memorable one for me. It was the last one I had with my family for many, many years. My father, mother, and my sister Gloria were there. 1944 was by far the grimmest year in northern Italy under Nazi occupation, with a civil war raging. Word got round that the butcher's shop in Porto Vetrovaglia had opened for Christmas. The butcher had managed somehow to secure 3 donkeys. My father grabbed 2 bottles of grappa, which he had illicitly distilled from sour wine. He and a fellow villager distilled it from a still he'd made out of thin copper tubing, smuggled out in pieces at great risk from the factory where he worked. And he and I shot down to Porto only to find a huge queue. When we finally got to the counter, the butcher told us he was very sorry, but only some offal was left. My dad waited until he'd sold out and then asked to have a word with him in private. He produced his 2 bottles of grappa, and they were exchanged for part of a prime cut that the butcher was saving for himself. We returned to Mussadino triumphantly with about 1 kilo of donkey meat. When I said to my dad that he'd taken a risk not taking the offal, which I would have done, he said, Peter, you didn't think he was going to leave himself without any meat, did you? My father was an excellent cook, and Christmas dinner was indeed memorable. Neither Gloria nor I could believe in the magnificent spread before our eyes. There was roast meat, potatoes and cabbage, wine to drink with dried pears as dessert, and chestnuts to round it off. In her exuberance at this unexpected windfall, my mother had thinly peeled the potatoes and discarded the peel. These skins were frantically retrieved Boxing Day, roasted and added to our usual fare. Here's a heartwarming insight into Christmas on Guernsey, one of the islands between France and Britain which were taken over and occupied by the Germans during the war. This is Christmas 44. After 5 years of occupation, and particularly since the D-Day Allied invasion of France, our supplies of everything were cut off for the civilian population and for the German forces. Our remaining lifeline, a port on the nearby French coast from whence a few supplies could be obtained, was now in Allied control, and on our little 9 miles by 4 miles island, we thousands of civilians and thousands of German troops struggled to survive long enough to be liberated. Food was in very short supply, mainly homegrown vegetables. Electricity and gas had to be severely rationed by turning off supplies from more or less sunset to sunrise, so that we were without heat or light all winter, and most of the little cooking there was on an open fire, for which we children gathered as much tree wood as we could find. However, the will for survival is strong, and my parents knew that the end of the war would be next year. While hoping and praying that we'd all live to see that time, they were determined that Christmas would be celebrated in the traditional manner, with the exception of the food, of course. The little 3-foot-high Christmas tree, made of feathers, I still use it, had been bought for my first Christmas in 1932. It was set up on a table in the bay window at the front of the house where I still live, and my job was to get the little boxes of baubles from the attic and decorate the tree. As the baubles were made of glass in those days, inevitably 1 or 2 did not last every Christmas, but there were enough to look festive, and the silver tinsel, now very crumpled, would not hang, nor was there much shine to it, but the silver star at the top that Mother had made years before of thick cardboard and silver paper shone beautifully, and that last Christmas of the war was a sunny day, so that our little tree and its ornaments looked its wartime best. During the morning, we noticed some soldiers on the footpath looking over the top of the hedge at our house, and one was pointing to the Christmas tree. Soon there was quite a group of soldiers. For a short time, we enemies were united as Christians, and my father said they must wish they were at home with their families and their trees. Our room was decorated with the various paper chains that had lasted 5 years. The main worry was the very thick multicoloured one that went across the ceiling from one side to the other, 14 feet. It was giving in several places, and each year my father removed it very carefully, putting as little strain on it as possible. There was little thread left to mend clothes, let alone use for repairing paper chains. As Dad removed the decorations in January 1945, the big chain parted in the middle. It had done its duty, keeping spirits high during the dark wartime Christmas times, and now it could fade away, but is always remembered. For that last Christmas of the occupation, we even had light for a few hours. A nurse friend of our family had an old-fashioned pre-World War I carbide lamp for her cycle. She was allowed out after curfew to nurse an old gentleman. We had the carbide lamp on the mantelpiece, and it provided a soft light over our little group of my grandmother, parents, 3 old friends and myself. It was just the smell of carbide is quite atrocious, and Dad said it was like having a skunk with us. Nevertheless, none of the party complained, and we talked about that day for many Christmases to come. As Mother said at the time, the main thing is we're all together, and that was written by K. Le Cheminot from Guernsey. This next one's a Christmas memory aboard ship, and it's all about troops on a troop ship on the Straits of Gibraltar, and it features the Royal Navy, and this one's by Leslie Hesford. The sound of Holy Night or the first Noel bring back memories of Christmas to all of us. But my father, Leslie Hesford, remembered a rather different piece of music, taking him back to an unusual and distant 24th of December. He recalled, "A fine clear sunrise on Christmas Eve over a calm Atlantic Ocean was a cheering sight after the very stormy weather that the 23,000-ton troop ship Strathden and the other ships in our fast convoy had faced on previous days. The convoy was steaming eastwards, and in the afternoon Cape Spartel in Morocco appeared above the horizon. At a signal from the Commodore's ship, the convoy turned 180 degrees and sailed away from the land. Just before sunset, we changed course again and headed eastwards to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar during the hours of darkness. To entertain the troops for Christmas Eve, the pipes and drums of the Scottish Rifles, the Cameronians, who were amongst the units on board, performed the ceremony of beating the retreat on the open deck, and lit by a spectacular sunset over the deep blue of the Atlantic, I heard a tune on the pipes which will always recall the scene in my thoughts. After darkness had fallen, the convoy, in line ahead, and in total blackout, sailed slowly through the straits, with the troops lining the ship's rails, gazing with envy and amazement at the bright twinkling lights of the villages and roads in Spain, far away on our port side, to disappear from sight as we steamed into the darkness of the Mediterranean and Christmas Day. My unusual Christmas carol? The 79th Highlanders' Farewell to Gibraltar, a reminder of an out-of-the-ordinary Christmas Eve. At this stage, I want to say thank you for your support throughout the year. Thank you for making time to listen. Thank you for all the great feedback and family stories just made for sharing. Have a delightful December, a cracking Christmas, a happy Hogmanay, and a brilliant 2023. And here's a Christmas stocking full of PSs to end the show, beginning with a story, not heard before, of how my dad got wounded 3 weeks after surviving the Gold Beach landings on D-Day. So this is drawn from Dad's World War II book, Fighting Through, From Dunkirk to Hamburg. This is about Normandy, and it's the end of June 44, less than a month after D-Day. Here it goes. It was now 30th of June, and we'd halted during a lull in the aggression from both sides in the conflict. We spread out, overlooking a field about 4 yards apart, along one of the ditches which seemed to be never-ending. But even when resting, we had to be constantly on the alert. From this position, my section was sent on a patrol during daylight at about 10:30 hours, and was fired upon by the enemy. So we retraced our steps and made a report to our officer. But I think we must have been observed returning to our units because of the shelling which followed. Half an hour later, a pal and I were sitting on the bank of our ditch with our backs to the hedge, having our tiffin, when it happened. We all knew that as long as we could hear shells passing overhead, they were not meant for us. If they were, we would not hear them, and would not feel much when it happened, because it was so sudden. Well, one came over which I didn't hear. The first thing I knew was that I'd been thrown into the air and had landed 5 yards away. I'd not felt a thing, but knew that I'd been wounded, feeling blood running down my leg, but no pain at all. I'd been hit on the inside of my left thigh, very near to you-know-what. It was incredible how quickly it happened. The blast and shrapnel wounded my pal also. I think how easily I could have been killed. Still, I would not have known anything about it. Somebody called for the stretcher bearer, which they shouldn't really have done in case the sound carried to the enemy. The first aid soldier came up, tore my trousers off, and put a first aid dressing on my wound. Everyone carried a large field dressing in a special pocket as part of our battle dress. The wheels of organisation quickly got moving, and in no time at all, a 4-wheel drive jeep came up to the scene, and we were both put on a stretcher. We were fastened to the framework erected on the jeep for the purpose, and away we went. It was a very strange feeling to me at the time. The comradeship in those days was so great among the boys, it's difficult to describe. We were all pals who together had experienced the most traumatic events. We lived together, fought together, and sometimes died together, or very often depended upon each other for life itself. We became very close, sharing very emotional times, and our officers were included in all our sentiments. I don't remember whether I was sad or glad that I'd been wounded, but I knew that I experienced a great feeling of regret when the jeep drove across the field and I shouted, "So long, lads," and I never saw them again. They were probably thinking, "Lucky bugger, he's out of it," which, when it comes to the crunch, was true, because I could so easily have been killed that day. Now, my future lay wherever my fate took me. I was taken to a field hospital, which was a hive of activity. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? The Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC, was dedicated to taking care of the wounded. A young lad came and cut my trousers off. Then the medical officer examined my wound, which was now becoming painful. A large field dressing was put on, and I was given a morphine injection and went to sleep. Away from the sounds of war, I'd slept well between white sheets, but as soon as my eyes opened, I felt the pain of my wound. I saw the medical officer appear. He was going from bed to bed, asking how we were feeling and giving instructions to the orderlies, one of whom dressed my wound and gave me a morphine injection. I was not feeling too good, and another orderly brought me a cup of hot, sweet tea and made me as comfortable as possible. These orderlies may not have been in the firing line, but they had the skills to do a different kind of job under very difficult circumstances in the field. Sometimes during the morning, an ambulance came, took 6 of us and headed for the coast. When I'd been wounded, our battalion was in a position near Villers-Bocage, a few miles from the coast, and the trip back to the beaches was slow because the roads were congested with military traffic, mainly the Royal Army Service Corps carrying supplies, which had priority. So it took us some considerable time to reach Arromanches, site of the British Mulberry Harbour. As I was being transferred to the ship, I felt the ambulance going over the hollow-sounding, floating roadway. As I went over, I was determined to try and have a look at the Mulberry. This prefabricated port was an amazing feat of engineering. Many years later, 40 in fact, and the first time I had returned to Normandy, all that remained of that magnificent harbour were the huge blocks of concrete, which will remain for many years to come as a monument to man's genius. My imagination ran wild. After I had been settled in a bunk, the effects of the morphine and the motion of the hospital ship soon sent me to sleep. I was most surprised when I was awakened to be told that we had arrived at Southampton, from where I had originally sailed to Normandy. It seemed ages ago. 2 orderlies carried my stretcher off the ship and put me into one of a fleet of ambulances, which was soon on its way to a Canadian hospital just outside of Southampton. It was a brand new complex built for the specific purpose of receiving casualties, and was made up of numbers of well-built wooden structures, each about twice the size of a Nissen hut, all on ground level. It was situated in lovely countryside, and each building was joined by a corridor to the next. It was the 22nd Canadian General Hospital, and its entire staff were Canadian, devoted to their calling, who treated us all with the utmost care and consideration for our comfort, showing gratitude for what we were, wounded soldiers who had at first hand experienced the horrors of war and who now needed their skilled attention. First of all, I was appointed and introduced to a Canadian orderly. He was a young man named Leslie Bueller. I was put on a blanket-covered couch, then stripped and bathed. All my clothes were thrown into a bin, and a new field dressing was put on my wound, which was giving me some pain. They put a nightshirt on me, then took me to a ward and put me into a lovely clean bed with white sheets and pillowcases. To me, that was luxury. It was almost worth being wounded for, and a far cry from the fighting of 2 days ago. After a short while, a medical officer came and examined my wound, which was bleeding again and beginning to cause me some distress. Within 1 hour, I was having an X-ray to determine the extent of penetration of the shrapnel. I was no sooner back in my bed than I was out again onto a trolley and given the usual pre-med jab to make me drowsy before being taken to the operating theatre, where a surgeon told me all about my wound. At this point, I could not feel my leg at all. Then 2 bottles were set up, one containing blood, the other with penicillin dripping into my arm. The mask was put over my face, and that was all I knew until I woke up. As is usual after surgery, I didn't quite know where I was, and after a little while my orderly came to me and said, "Well, William Cheel," he'd obviously taken this from my pay book, "you're all done and dusted." And then he handed me something wrapped in a bit of gauze for a souvenir. It was the piece of shrapnel recovered from my wound, from an 88mm shell about 1.5 inches long and over 1/4 of an inch thick. Leslie Bueller asked me if I realised how lucky I'd been, because the shrapnel, had it hit me 1 inch higher, would have prevented me from being a parent. When the surgeon came to see me, he said that the piece of steel had penetrated so far into my upper thigh that they had had to put a 4-inch cut in my backside to remove it. I still have the shrapnel for a souvenir, and also the 2 scars of my wound. Listen, there's a photograph of Dad's shrapnel in the show notes. This was my first contact with the Canadians, and I found them to be very efficient and caring. The hospital unit was run entirely by men, and my orderly waited on me hand and foot. I've been empathetic towards Canada ever since. Thank you, Canada. A parting anecdote. In December 1947, after the war, I received a Christmas card from Leslie Bueller, the boy who was my orderly in the 22nd Canadian General Hospital. It had been sent to Dundee Royal Infirmary and forwarded to my home address. What a lovely thought from a complete stranger. It was posted in Three Hills, Canada, and is still amongst my souvenirs. And there's a photograph of that in the show notes as well. PPS. Sharing Christmas with prisoners of war in England. And this one features Betty Edmonds and Ken and Emily Adams from Mansfield in Nottingham. I was about 6 years of age. Christmas was a very special time, and my mother saved rations and coupons for Christmas cake and a pudding, which I helped to mix, and put in 3 silver penny bits. Somehow we always had one each. Prisoners, usually Italian I believe, and a few German, were under guard in quarters in Sherwood Forest. Dad was serving in the NFS, the National Fire Service. I don't know how arrangements were made, but trusted citizens were contacted via the NFS. On Christmas Day, 2 soldiers would arrive in the morning, bringing 3 prisoners. They were always family people, kind, thoughtful, and had good manners. They played with me, told me stories of their homes, and we laughed a lot. We sat round a cheery coal fire in the front room. We usually only had a fire in the dining room. We shared a wonderful Christmas dinner. Dad always made a table decoration out of cotton wool and hid a few sweets in parcels in it. We each pulled a string and had a present. The guests always brought presents. I remember a hand-painted towel for Mum and Dad, a wobbling wooden duck for me, a homemade puppet from a sock. Dad had a handmade cigarette box. Our guests were given socks and gloves, and on one occasion a guest said he missed his wife's linen, so Mum made him 2 pillowcases from an old sheet and embroidered them. After dinner, we played games in the front room. Card games, magic puzzles such as Sorters and Photographer. I've tried these with children in school, and they are fascinated. The King's Speech was a must on the radio. We also sang carols round the piano. One guest was brilliant, and he and Dad played duets. I recall hugging one guest as he stood by our Christmas tree in the hall, crying as he said his family's names. Mum asked if they had photos, and all had, so we put the pictures on the tree and sang a carol. It was wonderful. Tea time was supper. Sandwiches, homemade buns, Christmas cake, jelly. At 6 p.m, the escorts arrived. They were given a glass of sherry, guests too, and wished Happy Christmas and a blessed New Year. I've often wondered what happened to our guests. Each year they made Christmas special. They too had loved ones, even in wartime. We shared what little we had and celebrated the true meaning of Christmas. Where are they now, 64 years later? And has that guy still got the embroidered pillowcases, I wonder? PPS. Christmas Day 1944 with American soldiers. In 1944, American soldiers injured in the Normandy offensive were hospitalised in the Sudbury area. Miss Smith, a teacher at Bemrose School in Derby, appealed for any families who'd be able to entertain soldiers on Christmas Day. My mother and father agreed to offer hospitality. So it was that 2 American soldiers arrived by army truck on Christmas morning to join in our festival meal and spend time with a typical English family. They stayed with us for the whole day, telling us all about themselves and their family back home. In the evening, we played the usual parlour games of that era, like Subject and Object, finishing up with a sing-song. This included such songs as Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover and Coming on a Wing and a Prayer, accompanied by Mother on the piano. The 2 soldiers were really appreciative of the time they'd spent with us, and Mother kept up a correspondence with them and their families for many years after the war. They even sent us small food parcels during those difficult days of rationing. In my autograph album, I treasure the 2 entries which they made. To a very, very swell English family who made a Christmas a long way from home almost as perfect as if I had been at home. Remember a GI who you made very happy. Garvin Haste, Los Angeles, California. May your joys be as deep as the ocean, and your troubles as light as its foam. Happy New Year wishes, and hope you will have many more joyous Christmas days. With many thanks, Robert W. Colts, Salt Lake City, Utah. After this account appeared in the Derby Telegraph, a reader from the Ripley area with friends in Utah made contact with a Mrs. R.W. Coates. She turned out to be the wife of Robert Coates, who sadly died in February 2004. I wrote to her and sent a copy of the page from my autograph album, along with photos of the family in 1946 and one of my wife Nora and myself. She was delighted and in return sent me photographs of herself and Robert. She also included an account of his Christmas Day with us, which he had written for his family. The same reader from Ripley then did search for Garvin Haste and found only one in America. He lived in Las Vegas and at the time was aged 83. So I wrote an introductory letter to him and received an email back confirming that he was the GI who visited our family in 1944. We are now corresponding and exchanging photographs. How wonderful to make contact after 61 years. I've got to go now. I've got presents to wrap and Christmas cards to write. Merry Christmas everybody and a happy Hogmanay. I'm Paul Cheel saying cheers and above all, Slanjavar.